Welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar for Australian Wool Innovation Extension New South Wales. Today we're going to be talking all about winter sheep nutrition. It's going to be an update presented shortly by Nicole Logg, and I'll introduce you to Nicole shortly. My name's Fiona MacArthur and I'm a member of the AWI Extension New South Wales team. For those of you who haven't joined us for a little while, welcome to AWI Extension New South Wales, formerly known as Sheep Connect New South Wales. We have a new name and a new look and a brand new website to go with it, but we haven't changed what we're doing here at the network. We're still AWI's largest grower extension network with over 6,600 members, and you can stay in touch with us via our website and our social media. Give you a little bit of background about Nicole. Nicole is a livestock nutritionalist with over 20 years of experience in ration formulation and on-farm support. Her passion lies in balancing scientific research, product innovation, and on-farm efficiency to support livestock nutrition and improve their health and performance. In her consulting business, The Livestock Coach, she helps farmers plan and optimize their livestock operation to improve their performance and production. Nicole and her husband have a mixed farming operation down at West Wyalong, and they're producing wool, prime lamb, and beef cattle. Also accredited for lifetime ewe management with Australian Wool Innovation and winning with weaners as a deliverer, and has recently been awarded an Nuffield Farming Scholarship in 2023, which she's undertaking now, sponsored by Australian Wool Innovation. So thank you very much for joining us, Nicole. I have your presentation up on screen, so you're right to go.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for having me along today. It's very wintry at the moment, so it's a great topic we're getting into today. So today I sort of wanted to split it up really into three sections, and it's all about balance. We want to look at literally from the ground up some of the soil factors that can affect our plant nutrition, which ultimately can affect our sheep nutrition as well. So we're going to tackle those three components today and look at how we can balance that up, balance any excesses, and look at any deficiencies that might come up to make sure that we can get the most out of our pastures that we want to graze for our sheep. So a little on soil factors, and if there's any agronomists on the webinar, they'll probably have seen this Mulder's chart before. But pH is a big one that can affect mineral availability from the soil, obviously for plant uptake. In general, we seem to see that the more slightly acidic side of things, our trace elements will be more available. And when our big macro minerals, like things that we need in grams per kilo rather than milligrams per kilo, they tend to be a bit more available when the soil's a little bit more alkaline. Generally speaking, in New South Wales, we tend to have slightly acidic soils, and you know your own place better than anyone, and you'll see those differences even between paddocks as well. But we tend to be on the more slightly acidic side, which leans towards some of those absorption of some of those trace elements a bit better. Other soil factors are really temperature. So no surprises that it gets colder in winter there. That's a little graph from sort of Tamworth, but it's pretty well the same for most of New South Wales, just that the temperatures will vary. And basically what happens in winter when the soil starts to get cold, we have some winter grasses and plants starting to away or crop, and that we have this sort of double whammy effect, I guess, cold soil temperatures and this small root growth, underdeveloped root growth of these winter grasses as they start to, and legumes as they start to get away. So when they're small and underdeveloped, they can't take up as much nutrients and some of those minerals that we want to see as much as we'd like. So that sort of reduces that mineral availability. So we get a slowing of sort of growth as we see, and then that root growth to take up the nutrients is lacking as well. So a little bit more as we move into the plant design side of things now, and this is regarding sunlight. So obviously plants need sun to photosynthesize, and this graph's just one showing the sunlight hours in West Wyalong with the numbers along the bottom. Number 1 is January, number 6 is June there. So we see obviously a significant decrease in sunlight in winter, obviously. Probably not so bad really sort of here, probably further north, but we really need that sunlight to help those plants develop and grow. I was actually just talking to another vet nutritionist not a vet, but he was a vet nutritionist down at a conference last week, and we we're discussing the implications of vitamin D. So sunlight is a source of vitamin D, reacts with the skin for the animal to have a source of vitamin D, which is important for the absorption of calcium. So this is where sunlight comes into play. Now, he sort of quantified it a little bit, and he called it 35-degree latitude and south, which in New South Wales, it's sort of Wagga, Jerilderie, and south of there, where vitamin D deficiencies may be a little bit more prevalent. But sometimes it's really just dependent on that winter, and this winter's probably quite a typical one for us, with a bit more cloud cover around as well. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of some of these potentially vitamin D and calcium deficiencies that come up, and also nitrate accumulation too. So if that plant's not using that nitrogen in the soil as much because it's not growing as much because there's less sunlight, we can sometimes get a build-up of nitrates in the plants as well. So a little bit on plant design, and this one sort of, I must do a little shout out to Dr. Gordon out at DPI Carroll. I was talking the other week about my Nuffield topic, and he gave me a great little rundown on sort of some of these plant design features as well. Here's our clovers and medics, Bicerella, Ceradellas, those sort of things. They're pretty good with calcium and magnesium. Naturally, they'll supply some of that. They tend to be not too bad on things like a little bit of copper as well coming through. They are quite low on selenium naturally, and they are still low on sodium. So that was a really interesting one that I got out of my chat with Gordon there as well, which will come up a little bit later. We'll link all this back together. With our grasses and our cereal crops and that sort of thing, they're sort of a little bit lighter on calcium and magnesium. They sort of tend to be a bit lower than we'd like, and I've got some graphs there to show you in a minute on those. The big one is they're very high in potassium and low in sodium, and that's due to their sort of water conservation properties. Potassium levels, very high potassium levels in the grass-based crops and pastures. So a little bit, we'll move into cereal crops now and grazing those cereal crops, and they've just become so popular the last 10 or 15, 20 years. But why that is that we sort of, we tend to have a fairly typical autumn feed gap as we move out of January, that summer dried pastures, lower in quality, a bit of bulk perhaps. We're still sort of waiting for that break to get our winter annuals away. So usually if we can jam in a little bit of crop early on, something like Moby barley or any of the grazing crops, we can usually get them up and running pretty quickly before those winter feeds and winter annuals come into play. So they can help us fill a bit of a grazing, a feed gap there in autumn. They're pretty hardy. You can graze them pretty hard and then take the stock off, and they recover quite well. And it really frees us up also if we get that early grazing in, to let some of those other grasses and clovers get away as we head into winter as well, and have a bit more feed for later on. And they're a great source of energy. They're sort of tipping 12, 13 megajoules per kilo of energy as well. So they can be really, really handy for us. What's not so good about them, and this is a Moby barley sample I took for the feed on offer library that's sponsored sort of under by AWI, I suppose. But this crop here and these test results that go under it, and they are really, really high in moisture. So this result is for that picture above, and it would come out at 88% moisture. So for every kilo, that's 880 grams of moisture in that feed, or 12% dry matter if you look at it the other way as well. So for every mouthful, kilo of feed that ewe eats, she's getting, all lamb, they're getting a lot of moisture in there, and that can come into play with fast rate of passage through the rumen, and we can tend to see some scouring and that sort of thing, because there's just physically so much water in those plants. The other one is really high protein levels. So you can see here, this one actually tested at 27.1% crude protein. Remembering crude protein is really nitrogen times 6.25 to give us a result there, but very, very protein. Now, whilst the energy, you can see there's 1 megajoules supply, there's just so much protein in there that we, sort of don't have quite the balance of energy to come in and, balance that high protein out. And I'll just touch on quickly here to water-soluble carbohydrates. So they're just a sugar component of it. And this is actually relatively low for this type of crop that I would see. Some of the water-soluble carbohydrate levels with grazing crops probably a little shorter in height. I've seen them up to sort of 30% sugar, so quite tasty. Then you'll see some of the sheep really cook into those crops because they've got such nice tasty sugar levels in there. The other one that's probably not so good that you would have heard about, I'm sure, before is this mineral imbalance and leading to a lot of metabolic type diseases. So just touching before on those wheat genetics, those grazing wheats, for example, they're just really low in sodium and they're just super high in potassium, and they're designed that way to conserve what water they have. There's sort of sodium potassium pumps in cells that have got to work together, so we can get some imbalances there. And the biggest cause of metabolic disease that we see, and this was actually just last week at the same conference, was the district vets in New South Wales for the DPI. The biggest issue they saw was hypocalcemia in ewes grazing cereal crops. So you'll tend to see it more in the older ewes because they can't absorb that calcium out of their gut as well, or resorb it back out of their bones for when they need to use it. Of course, late pregnancy, when there's a lot of fetal bone being built, especially in our twin-bearing ewes, there's just so much calcium that's required to be used to build that fetal bone. So I'll just quickly touch on hypocalcemia a little bit more as well. And just to give you an idea of what they may look like, they tend to sit on their sternum, on their sort of chest. The ewes, they're relatively bright and alert compared to some of the ones that will have pregnancy toxemia, for example. They're sort of obviously a little bit more away with the fairies. And sometimes they kind of get a bit of a froggy leg shape out the back as well. But that's a classical sign of hypocalcemia if you see it. Some of the other mineral imbalance issues that pop up is the low magnesium or hypomagnesia, but that tends to probably happen more into lactation as more magnesium's coming through the milk. And a low calcium and magnesium supply for that ewe can also lead to difficult lambings because calcium and magnesium are involved in nerve transmission and muscle function as well. So trying to all those uterine contractions, trying to get those lambs out. So if they're a bit light on them, they can have a delayed or difficult lambing. Vitamin D, I touched on a little before with sunlight. Sometimes it's very year dependent, but sometimes we see those sort of autumn, early winter born lambs going into a cloudy winter, come marking or weaning time, they can end up with some broken bones. So vitamin D is rickets, but it is very strongly linked to calcium deficiencies as well, because vitamin D is what's required to help calcium be absorbed into the body. So they're all linked, and in fact, magnesium is also required in there to activate the vitamin D to absorb the calcium. So these two minerals, calcium and magnesium and vitamin D, are all inextricably linked, and they all have a role in supporting health. And indirectly, we also see a reduced appetite. So if you've got ewes sitting around not moving, they can't eat, and often then we see a sort of snowball effect with pregnancy toxemia becoming an issue as well. So a little bit deep dive more into some of the minerals that are supplied. So I've just pulled out those two big calcium and magnesium minerals, the macros that we want to see in there, sodium and potassium. And what I really just wanted to point out here is how high the potassium levels are in some of our grazing crops compared to sodium. Lucerne and legumes don't tend to be quite as bad. And I've also thrown in just oat and hay and barley grain if you're a little bit short on feed at the moment, what they sort of supply. So still quite high potassium levels, just not nearly quite as extreme as the green grazing crops. And similarly for barley grain, which we have more of an issue with low calcium and low sodium in our grains. But with our grazing crops, certainly potassium's really, really high in there. And as mentioned, we've got these sodium potassium pumps that sort of need to work together, and sodium's really, really important to drag magnesium across the wall to be absorbed as well. So there's another link there with all these big minerals. I'll just quickly touch on grazing canola as well. It's become really quite popular over the last few years too. And I think a lot of that is it grows really fast, it grows really well, there's a lot of feed there. And we have the newer varieties have less goitrogen. So goitrogen plays a role in goiters if you see them in the necks, but it's also tied in with the thyroid hormones and can result in iodine deficiencies, some of these goitrogens that come in the older varieties of canola. So we don't tend to see them as much anymore. They're pretty handy for calcium and magnesium supply. And interestingly, the fibre levels in grazing canola were shown to be a little bit lower than wheat, which is a little concerning. However, some of the CSIRO work found no benefit in providing extra roughage specifically for young sheep in terms of increased growth rate. So you'll see a little bit later on the addition of some fibre in some of the grazing wheat trials showed that they help increase growth rates as well. But I'd still like to see a little bit of fibre out because it will, it's offered there, it's fairly cheap at the moment, a cereal, hay or straw, to get that out and just have that on offer if they want to help balance themselves out in terms of moisture levels in the feed. And the other big one is nitrates. So canola is a pretty nitrogen hungry plant. So it might have been pre-drilled with some urea or had some urea put on it to keep it going. And just naturally, the type of plant that it is will tend to have high nitrate levels, which you just need to watch to make sure we don't get any nitrate, technically nitrite poisoning. So a little bit on deeper dive into nitrates. So they can tend to accumulate in dry conditions as well. So at the break of a drought, those plants will be a lot higher in nitrates. The cloudy weather that we talked about for winter, they can knock the plants aren't photosynthesizing as much, so it's not using that nitrogen there, so they can tend to build up a little bit. If we put urea or something like ammonium sulfate on as well, urea is probably the most common one there to increase the nitrogen content in plants. And also just be aware of when you're yarding them in your small paddocks or your sheep yards, that we tend to get all these interesting weeds like marshmallow and capeweed and singing nettles and things that come in. And if they're in there for a little while and they home into them as they're getting a bit hungry, those plants can be really high in nitrates as well. So we tend to see it more in younger plants, so that the nitrate levels sort of dissipate a little as that plant gets a bit bigger. They tend to be in the lower part of the plant and with the leaves containing less nitrate as well. So in terms of the grazing ones, as I mentioned, grazing canola, but also oats probably tend to be a little bit higher in nitrates than something like your barley or your wheats. So just on nitrates, why is it such an issue and what happens? So if we've got them grazing some high nitrate crops or pastures there, the rumen microbes, they're pretty good. They quickly break down nitrate into nitrite. So we drop an oxygen molecule there. This is a really fast and quick conversion. The conversion from nitrite to ammonia is a lot slower. So we've got a lot of this coming in and we don't have the right balance of rumen microbes to do their work to break it down to ammonia. This is when they start to build up, and nitrite itself interferes with the hemoglobin molecule, which carries oxygen around the body and the blood, and basically turns it to hemoglobin, which basically sort of starves that animal of oxygen. So if you ever see an animal that's had nitrate or nitrite poisoning, the blood's quite chocolatey brown colour because there's no oxygen there to give it that bright red colour there, and that's sort of what the issue is and how they die. So what we want to try and do is obviously convert this as much as we can, so we can bring in some extra carbohydrate or energy source, and something like grain is really nice and energy dense that those microbes can use to help break down and convert nitrite to ammonia a little better. The other sort of compounding factor, even if we don't get sort of toxic levels of nitrite, is we've got to excrete what's not being used out through the liver, converts it to urea and then excreted through the kidneys, excreted as urine. This process here is really energy costly. So that energy that we could be using for growth and trying to balance up this conversion sort of is taken away and used to excrete this excess protein or nitrite that's in the system. So when we get our ammonia, the microbes really like nitrogen and hydrogen. They use those themselves. They've got their own life cycle. So if we can keep those microbes happy, that's when we can get some extra protein that can go towards our production. But that's a bit of a summary of the issue with nitrates. It's actually really nitrite that's a problem in the system. So just a few sort of solutions, I guess, to try and work with that. So if we are top dressing with urea, we really want to wait for that leaf growth post application to reduce some of this nitrate toxicity risk. I like to allow 2 to 3 weeks, preferably 3. It's hard when you've got to be patient and wait for crops to go. So that'll be a little bit dependent on your weather, sunlight, and that sort of thing happening. The DPI in WA sort of suggested, a week after, I think it was at least 8 mil of rain on an application of urea to last. But I really think that there's probably not going to be enough leaf growth to recover and provide enough dry matter or feed essentially for to regraze that crop anyway. So I guess it depends where you are. We tend to graze ours out and then put some urea on and get them cranking again. But yeah, I prefer to go pretty steady on that one and make sure we give her a bit of a close enough to 3-week break. Providing that hay or straw, it really needs to be more of a cereal hay type, a low protein. So people say, is vetch okay? It's really quite high in protein vetch hay, so we're just adding sort of more protein to the issue. So a cereal hay that's palatable is really handy, and if you can fill them up before you move them on there, so whatever paddock or yard, for example, they're in, try and get some palatable hay and straw into them, so they've got a gut full of hay to make sure that they've you're not going to go out there and gorge on that crop and get way too many nitrates. Talked a little bit about providing some cereal grain as well to balance that high protein or utilize that high protein a bit better, just maximize what you can get out of that paddock too. And then some people will sort of put stock on and on. I think that's probably going to come down to have and your paddock size and your paddock location within the farm as well to be able to do that. But that's a good way to just bring in small amounts of allow the sheep to sort of adjust to that nitrate as well. If you're in sort of drought conditions and it's coming out of, I've had some rain and it's coming out of a break, we just really need a little bit of time, be patient for that grass to get growing again, even though it looks green and you really want to let your sheep out on there, just give them a little bit of time to get some more leaf growth on it, and you'll get more out of the paddock and reduce the risk of nitrates as well, nitrate toxicity. And if you're looking at any hay or silage that's come from drought areas as well, testing for nitrates in there would be beneficial too. I'll just touch on Phalaris this year, now for this year as well. Obviously, there's paddock just of Phalaris has probably been in a trial, but Phalaris is sort of 2 forms. There's sudden death, which tends to happen earlier in autumn and early winter, and then staggers, which is sort of, I guess, a little bit more noticeable as well. But it's due to the alkaloids in the young Phalaris shoots that are growing, and low cobalt can sort of exacerbate that. So when we do, cobalt's predominantly ingested through the soil. So when we don't have, sheep aren't eating as close to the ground, for example, they're not getting that cobalt. That can be a bit of a double whammy. And also with things like lambs, where their rumen's still developing to be able to utilize that cobalt to make B12, that's sort of still that rumen's still developing there. But if you want to try and look at it, it's really a preventative thing, again, making sure they're full of hay and getting some cobalt into them before they're actually grazing that pasture as well. I'm only aware of one cobalt bolus in Australia, rumen bolus, which is the Cooper's permatrace. Just so you know, vitamin B12 isn't actually of any use. It's the microbes utilising that cobalt in the rumen, and that process is what helps detoxify the alkaloids. So it's not actually a B12 deficiency type issue. You can also try and supply some, licks or lick blocks that are higher in cobalt, but you probably get slightly varying intakes between sheep. So something like a bolus, that they've all got them. And they last for a few years as well. And then you can also look at foliar application cobalt if it's a really big issue. But getting some other plants in there too would be able to help that out as well. So they've got a selection to choose from. So a little bit more on the management side of things when we're grazing, say cereals in particular. You want to make sure that plant can't be sort of pulled out of the ground. When you get the sheep off there, can be up for debate when you want to do that. They sort of talk about the Z30 stage of growth in the crop, but I just find that the sheep don't eat it perfectly down all across the paddock. We'll have areas that are raised right down to the ground, and then there's still some that's quite tall. So, and that's a little bit of grazing pressure, which can be difficult with ewes and lambs. But in general, I know for our area, must have them off by mid-August to allow that crop to recover. So we'll be a bit area dependent, probably further north of here, West Wyalong, could be a little bit earlier, further south, it might be a touch later, but that's our rule of thumb for sort of this area anyway. With lucerne, we miss the boat a little bit on this one, as most of it's going dormant, but certainly needs a rest in autumn to allow it to get cranky again later in the spring. So that's sort of a one for next year perhaps, but yes, it is important to rest your lucerne as well. So following urea application, just a quick summary, I really like a 3-week wait time to be able to graze those pastures or crops again, and just wait for that leaf growth to really sort of allow some extra feed for the sheep, and also sort of dilute the nitrates in a sense. How do we do it? So we've got look at some rotational grazing. Can be difficult to do if you've got some lambing paddocks there, but sometimes that works. Even if you've got a neighbouring paddock where you can just open the door and let them drift through, that will work quite well. Temporary fencing, so depending on paddock size really, if you want to run any electrical hot tapes across them. We've got virtual fencing for cattle now. I'm not sure if they've done any sheep collars just yet, but yeah, maybe in the future sometime that would help with grazing your paddocks a little bit better. And trying to match your stocking rates to crop growth. So if it does look like it's starting to get in front of you a little bit, you might need to consider boxing some mobs together to try and make the most of that feed. And then as they graze that down, just leave a little bit of leaf material there to get it cranking again if you can get some urea on it to get another graze out of it later on. This bit of leaf just helps that plant recover and get going again. So now we're just going to get into our sheep requirements. And you may have seen this before if you've seen any of my presentations, and it's Liebig's barrel. So this can really be applied to plants and or animals, but it's saying that growth is not dictated by the total resources available, but by the scarcest resource or limiting factor. So we look at that energy component in the crops. We've got plenty of protein, and then we start to look at our macros, the calcium, magnesium, sodium, and then our traces like zinc, copper, cobalt, that sort of thing as well. And also our vitamins such as vitamin D. So in terms of energy, we've got this is just a typical autumn break, spring break chart of pasture growth, and you can see the different types of pastures there as well. And on the right-hand side, we've got our energy requirements for our single ewes, twins, and triplets. So when you lamb and when that ewes lactating, for example, fairly high requirements, it needs to sort of fit in with your system at home. I know there's a lot of spring lambers around. We will tend to lamb some in a little in autumn and in winter as well. So we will sort of look at that, and that's why we graze cereal crops as well, to help fill some of this feed gap here too. But whenever you lamb, I guess the critical thing is day 90, around scanning time, is when our multiple bearing ewes will start to require a bit more energy. Come lambing time, day 150, and then into lactation, we can see there's huge demand on energy for those ewes. So it's really thinking about obviously matching up what you've got available to sow or have pastures available for those ewes, and jumping in and doing a lifetime ewe management course will give you all the knowledge you need to how to tackle that and balance it up best for the ewes. So just I'll just do a couple of quick little scenarios with energy and protein here, just on some of our grazing crops. And really, the energy coming from grazing crops will be very similar to the energy out of legumes or any grain feed, really, improved pastures. So I'll just take an example of our 30-kilo lamb. We wanted to crank along and try and get 300 grams per day out of them. And they actually need around 15 megajoules a day to do that. And they'll eat about 1.25 kilos of dry matter. Now that's probably going to be something like 6 kilos with that really high moisture content in there. So, but this is on a dry matter basis, so we'll work on that. Per day, you get at least 12 sort of megs out of our grazing crop, and we can hit that quite well. So the energy coming in is really going to, adequate to balance that, to support that growth rate. Now, interestingly, on day 150, we can see that a single bearing ewe at the point of lambing also needs around 15 megajoules. Now, I wouldn't lamb single bearing ewes if I didn't have to on a grazing crop, because I think their fetal growth will be too big and we can lead to dystocia issues. However, twins and triplets would be more suitable in what we do. And honestly, what I do here at home is I will lamb them down. I prefer to lamb them down on legume-based pastures because of those metabolic issues and the risk of hypocalcemia, especially in our twins and triplets on grazing cereals in particular. So that's sort of something that I do. I just feel that they push too hard metabolically to lamb on grazing crops, even though they still can, and you just got to really support them through that. But we've got an option for a legume-based pasture, as we saw that calcium and magnesium set up a little bit better. So with protein, we had really high crude protein values in our crops. So this same lamb, needs, it's in grams per day, I'm sorry, instead of percentage of protein, but, it's probably around at least 14, 15%, 16 would be better. So this is, they're going to get 350 grams per day based on a same dry matter intake on a 28% protein crop. And that's pretty well double what they need. So that's all where we lead to that, having to get rid of it through the urine and excrete that, share that out. And then we've got an energy cost associated with that as well. So whilst our energy was supportive to do those 300 grams a day growth rates, there's actually some of that's going to be used to get rid of this excess protein as well. So I did the same sort of scenario here. It's a bit busy, this slide, I'm sorry, but we had that grazing wheat and oats and lucerne over on the right here. And I've just mirrored it, or put it together with sort of the life cycle of the ewe through pregnancy as well. So you can see that green is calcium and blue is magnesium. So generally speaking, our legume-based and lucerne legume-based pastures will provide plenty of calcium and magnesium for those ewes. We still have too much potassium in there. So whilst the sodium is pretty close, we're going to have to look at some sodium coming into the system. And you can see here that our grazing wheat and oats, for example, are a little light on calcium. They're still supplying some and some magnesium, but again, we have this effect of too much potassium and not enough sodium coming in for those sodium potassium pumps to work the best. And similarly for lambs, we can see here just the 30, 40, 50 kilo lambs. Similar sort of scenario. It's actually, not too bad for calcium and magnesium for the lambs compared to the pregnant ewes. You can see that the grazing lucerne will provide plenty of calcium and magnesium as well. Because again, we just have this overlay effect of way, way, way too much potassium. So you may have seen some of this work before from the CSIRO on lamb requirements and versus on a grazing wheat, and looking at adding some of these macro minerals to help them balance everything out. So we can see that, as I just mentioned, we're not too bad for magnesium and calcium for what the lamb needs and what the grazing wheat actually provides. Potassium, though, we've got a lot more coming in than what they actually need. And sodium, they're a little bit light on as well. So this ratio that we want to look at should be around 8 to 1, ideally. But we've got, 64 to 1 when we're looking at what that grazing wheat provides. So we had some really great data showing the live weight gain and improvement by adding some basic sort of supplements there. So when they had nothing, they grew at 184 grams a day. When they just provided some hay, there was jumped up to 225 grams per day. And when they added a source of magnesium in the form of Cause Mag in a mixture with limestone and salt, we jumped up to nearly about 300 grams per day on that crop. So significant increase in live weight gain by just adding a few macro minerals into the system. Now, this might sound like a little slight tangent here at weaning time, but I do see some issues pop up with lambs at weaning, and it really all bounces off stress and stress levels. So, they come in for yarding, they get tagged, but they have their animal health booster vaccinations, drench, etc. Then mum's got taken away. So, they bar a lot, they urinate a lot, they're losing a lot of fluids. They have a depressed appetite because they're not drinking and they're losing fluids as well. And then the other part is the stress response is that they dump minerals into their system because they think they're going to die. So they go into their flight and fight response. And this is when you'll see calcium deficiencies pop up. So I've seen it quite a bit, sort of a lot in the drought as well. But they'll come in, they're stressed out. They may or may not have been supplemented, most likely not been supplemented anything when you get a calcium deficiency. And that's when they'll sort of, get stiff legs and they just effectively die fairly quickly, actually. That's something to look out for. And so it's really about that sort of setting them up before weaning to help them cope with that. The other thing it does, this stress obviously suppresses their immune function. So any energy and protein that could be put towards growth and the immune system, isn't there because they're just stressing their cortisol response. So if you want to learn more about helping your weaners and getting them growing, certainly suggest looking into the Winning with Weaners program. So a little bit on plant solutions. Now, I didn't touch on pulpy kidney because it was not as dire as hypocalcemia, but certainly can be an issue if you're coming off different types of feed. Remember I mentioned before about those sugar levels, those really high sugar levels in some of the grazing crops and some of the grass-based pastures. Those clostridial diseases love those sugars coming in, and they can just have a party, and basically, that's when you'll get your pulpy kidney issues coming in. So making sure we do that double vaccination, marking and weaning to protect against pulpy kidney when we change onto grazing crops, for example, post-weaning or post-marking, that sort of thing. Certainly that high moisture issue I talked about, and effectively a low fibre issue in some of those winter crops and pastures coming in, just providing some cereal hay, so the lower protein hay that's palatable that they want to eat will help them digest. Well, first of all, slow the rate of passage down through the rumen, so they'll get more out of the feed that you want them to digest. It'll actually help keep them warm as well. So when that hay takes a little longer to break down than the sugars, for example, in the plants, and that heat of fermentation actually helps keep them warm. So when we have these cold wintry days, just simply supplying some cereal hay just to help keep them warm will be a really good benefit as well. And especially if anyone shears over winter, certainly need to get some palatable hay out for them to help keep them warm. The high protein to sort of energy scenario, we can sort of bring in some cereal grain there to help better utilise the nitrogen in the pastures. It has a really good effect too if you've got ewes out there for imprinting. I don't put any cereal grain out till after marking because I don't want self-feeders out there or trail fed if I don't have to, if I've got some ground cover, and I just let those ewes lamb down, and we just significantly reduce lambs being left behind at self-feeders and that sort of thing. So I don't put any out. They got to survive till marking time, and then we'll start to introduce some grain to them. But really important, I think, just the imprinting factor as well as helping balance out those high protein pastures. And then sometimes with some of these high sugars, we can look at, look at grain, adding something to that grain to obviously balance it out, a little bit of a buffer to help protect against this SARA means subacute ruminal acidosis. So a real mild acidosis can sometimes happen with all those sugars coming in too. Also, we can look at what we call complementary pastures. So looking to introduce a range of different pastures to help balance them out. So, some legumes to bring in some calcium and magnesium. There's just sort of been some work done as well to look at what plants contain more sodium, for example, to help balance that high potassium out as well. So there's lots of interesting like plantain and herbs and forbs that will fit that bill a little bit as well. So it'll depend on your system and what you're happy to bring in and what suits your soil types and your climate as well. But certainly with legumes, we do still see low sodium in there. So we want to make sure that there's some loose salt out there just to help balance up that sodium potassium pump I was talking about, which helps with magnesium absorption too. And on our grasses and or cereal crops, we really need to bring in those big macro minerals to help balance them out and get the most out of the paddock and performance out of your sheep as well. So there's always a bit of talk about how much and what rates. So that the CSIRO work was on 221, but that was actually on a weight on a bucket level. But volumetrically, 1, 1, and 1 is okay. So if you've got your 25 kilo bag of each, that's fine to mix up as well. And then a little on trace minerals, so cobalt supplementation over winter can be beneficial as well, just because we're not ingesting that soil as much. And then selenium and as for immune function and health, and also zinc. So zinc comes into that immune support as well, but also for hoof health. But we not long did a webinar on supplements for success a few months ago now. So check that out if you want to know a little bit more about that. So just sort of some take-home messages. Big fan of trying to get some cereal hay out there. So if we can preload them, we'll get them to fill up on hay before they go out onto the grazing crop. And I would like it out while they've got winter feed, green feed about as well. Slow that rate of passage down, keep them warm as well. Just be aware of where you put your hay and your minerals as well. Just watch your animal behaviour. If there's one part of the paddock that they haven't even gone to graze yet and they're eating in another part, just sort of, make sure you think about where you put those supplements. You don't want to just put them out there thinking they'll get there soon enough. Put them where they're actually grazing. Look at possibly providing that extra fermentable carbohydrate, that some grain to come in to help balance that high protein, really gets those animals cranking along. And, perhaps you need to look at utilising containment areas a little bit for next year. This would be in autumn, perhaps, just to let those paddocks get away. And honestly, that's something we do here at home most years, just to let that, it's a bit of a feed gap time, just to let those paddocks rest and let them get set up for lambing, so we don't have to worry about them as much. And we did do a webinar on feeding for dry conditions too that will be found on the website that delves into that a little bit more. But overall, it's just really about being a good stockman or stockwoman and looking at your sheep, see how they're doing, they're getting a bit scary, how they're tracking, looking at those pastures and crops too, and just keeping an eye on them all the time. Your stock and your plants, so your pastures. So just trying to keep that in balance, and monitoring is a great way to sort of help you make decisions. I have a feeling that's it. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Nicole. And our apologies, Nicole's webcam's not working and we had a few bandwidth issues. So we'll just keep my webcam off for now to make sure we don't lose everybody. We already have quite a few questions that have come through. So we have a good solid 15 minutes for question time. So I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A pane now. But I'll kick straight off, Nicole, with question time so that you get them all covered. Sure. So the first question that's come through is there the same problem with nitrite toxicity with the application of compost rather than synthetic fertilizers, e.g. grazing 2 to 3 weeks post-application?
I think it would be to do with the nitrogen content of the compost and how readily that's absorbed in. So I haven't done that myself, but I would assume that would be more of a sort of slow release nitrogen. So you could possibly graze that a little bit earlier. What I would probably suggest if you put it on is to, give it a week or so, do a feed test, and you can test for nitrates as well. And then you'll be able to sort of have a look at that. And most of the labs will give you an indication of where that sort of fits in terms of if it's high or low for particular class of animal you're looking at. So I would assume and sort of indicate that it would be a slower release type form of nitrogen, which means it's sort of available in a more slow release form as well. So, but to monitor that, a feed test looking at nitrates would certainly put you in the right place to understand where it's at.
Thanks, Nicole. Next question moves on to, one of your favourites, your supplement girl. What are your thoughts on calcium molasses plus 10% urea blocks?
I would use them when it's dry times. So urea, you need to make sure it's specific for sheep as well. So some of the urea blocks are cattle only, and that's because they can handle a bit more urea, and that's because sheep actually recycle urea and nitrogen back through their saliva more effectively than cattle do. So firstly, make sure it's specific for a sheep. This gives a tick for sheep on the box, but I would prefer them to be not on green feed, to be honest with you. And it's basically to provide a source of nitrogen for those rumen microbes to break down feed better and increase the microbial population, rumen microbial population, which are a source of protein themselves. So when we have lots of nitrogen in green feed, we don't really need the urea component of it. Use that for later on in a late spring, summer type scenario.
Thanks, Nicole. Next question is based down in Southern Tablelands, a farmer from down there. What would be a good pasture mix to establish, and they do not crop? They're running just sheep and cattle. Yeah,
sure. So I would talk to your local agronomist, or we've got Farm Lincoln tomorrow. I'm sure there's a grazing group down there as well, because your soil types and your climate will be specific. So plants that I'd recommend for out here are probably not going to grow there, for example. So if you can get to some pasture walks and trials, if there's anything like that about, but certainly a mix of legumes, so your clovers, medics, lucernes, that sort of thing, and some different types of grasses will certainly provide a range of minerals and nutrients to be a bit more balanced. You sort of have to watch your grazing management, because the sheep can sort of pick out the bits that they like, and some plants are tastier at certain times of growth. I always aim to try and have some sort of pasture as much year round as we can. I think, which we've got sort of clovers for winter and different lucernes and things, so even in the legume category there's some variation there on what's growing when, but that's sort of what I try to aim to do. And you can get some sort of local-ish pasture walks and trials. Hopefully there's some around, but that's sort of, trying to get a bit of diversity in there would help sort of balance everything out for sure.
Awesome. And the next question, and this is the last question I have in the Q&A panel at the moment. So if you'd like to keep Nicole online for a few more minutes, please pop your questions in. But does AWI have any information on the nutrient profiles of winter native pastures in New South Wales? And I do know that we do, Nicole, in the food on offer library, there are definitely some winter species in there, but I will pass over to you. We also have a little bit more in the Making More from Sheep and Grow More from Pastures resource, which is also on the website, on the wool.com website. So but I'll let you add in more, since that came rather specific to AWI.
No, the feed on offers library is a sort of place to start, but you can also start to build your own feed library yourself. So if they're sort of specific to your area and the types of plants, you can get a feed test done on them, and I would take a photo of the same time you did the feed test, and you can sort of store that on your computer and sort of know that at this stage of growth, these are the nutrients that's being provided as well. So that means it's very specific to what you're growing and that sort of thing. So I would, yeah, try the feed on off the library if nothing there sort of fits or you know, looks similar. Certainly, yeah, feed test. And I would suggest taking a photo and keeping that and building your own sort of library as well that you can refer to at different seasons and, yeah, different times of year.
Thank you. Next question is, and sorry, before we go on from there, you've mentioned that in some of your previous webinars that you've just spoken about there, how to do your own food on offer library. So that's sort of a good place to start if you need more information about that too.
Yeah.
Can you just use calcium and a salt loosely when feeding ewes and lambs on a cereal grain and hay while on short green pick, or would you still need to add magnesium into the mix?
Yeah, I would still add magnesium into the mix for a couple of reasons. One, in winter, we see that magnesium absorption from the soil is reduced. So that's the first part. And when they're lactating, because I think you said ewes and lambs, when they're lactating, they lose a lot more magnesium through their milk as well. So that just would be beneficial to certainly add that magnesium component. And you just reminded me, because one thing I just realized I forgot to mention on the high protein nitrates section is when we do have a lot of protein there and that nitrate, it actually reduces magnesium absorption as well. So there's some interactions that happen in the rumen. But when we have high protein and high potassium in that short grain feed, the magnesium absorption is reduced. So even what you're giving them, then probably not going to get quite as much absorption out of that based on those sort of high protein and high potassium factors coming in. So yes, definitely would add some magnesium in. So in New South Wales and generally probably around Australia, it's magnesium oxide, which is CORSMAG, and they don't tend to like any magnesium sources very much. That's the most common, and I know talking to Gordon Refshorgi the other week, they have tried some different magnesium sources like magnesium chlorides and sulfates, for example, but they had a similar response in terms of magnesium supply. So they will be absorbed slightly differently, but in Gordon's work that he's done out there, they didn't see too much of a difference. So whatever locally you can get, I think magnesium oxide's probably will be more palatable than a magnesium chloride or a magnesium sulfate from that perspective.
And the last question I've got is, can you give a little bit more information on, you commented, not providing grain to ewes and lambs in self-feeders or line feeding before weaning? Why is that?
During lambing, so it's I will let them lamb down before, and it's at mark. So I meant marking time if I said weaning time. So I'll let them all lamb down on, hopefully I'll preserve some ground cover using containment feeding, and then I'll lamb down, and then at marking time, so post marking, I will then add grain onto those high protein pastures. So whilst I would love to have them grain out during lambing, I just find there's just so many issues with if it's in a self feeder, they leave lambs behind. All those little lambs. So post marking, I just feel they're a little bit bigger. They don't tend to be left behind at self feeders and die basically. Or if they're hungry and trying to follow a trail, when you're trail feeding as well. So I just let them be. Personally, that's what we do, is we let them be until marking, and then they usually go into a fresh paddock, and then that's when I'll put grain feeders out to help those ewes along, imprint the lambs, and get them making the most out of that high protein feed that we have. Does that make sense? So let me know if you need any more info on that.
How do you present, this is a great question, your dry licks, so salt and lime, to your stock, and also how do you keep them dry?
Yeah, I just ran some out today, and I was just thinking about all the different types of supplement feeders I have. So I use a lick. I prefer a lick. I think the intake's a little bit better than a block personally. We have all sorts. We have hard to keep them dry. One that probably is closest to keeping them, or we've got a couple. So we've got a typical manufactured gal one with the roof over it. So we've got some of them. We've also taken the big plastic, your plastic IBC totes, Roundup or whatever comes in them. And you cut big squares out of the sides, so you sort of have access from two sides, and they've kind of, the rain can still blow in, but they've got a bit of a natural roof on them. And then we've just got some open ones as well, and they might be out for a day or so if it's raining, and then they get topped up. But yeah, there's a tricky one. You can add, if you really wanted to, you can add a calcium stearate or something like that, like a calcium with fatty acid on it, to give it some water repellency. I know some of the commercial ones will have that sort of similar product in there to sort of aid it running off. And yeah, we've got some sort of open style troughs that the water can sort of run off if it needs to. And I don't tend to use like 20-litre drums cut in half anymore. I find them a little small. You need a lot of them out to sort of allow intake for all of the use. And then the water sort of struggles to get away. We've got a couple of plastic water troughs with the bungs removed out of the end and that sort of thing as well to let it get away. But it's a good question. It's a bit tricky. But yeah, just you can get some with roof, but it doesn't stop the rain blowing in sideways, that's for sure. But yeah, hope that helps.
Last question. Grazing winter wheats. This person's had some issues in the past with photosensitivity leading to swollen heads. They've had some success with detox products, but what supplement would you recommend, mineral supplement, to help prevention?
Yeah, that's a good one. So photosensitization, some work's been done with a lot's been done in dairy cattle, for example, but also there's been a little bit of work done on sheep, but zinc is probably the best one, is the answer directly to your question. Zinc will help, that helps sort of the process of that, and help with skin health and immune health as well. So that's higher doses of zinc. So you can have it sort of, some of the hoof products will have higher doses of zinc, obviously for hoof health, but that will sort of have an aid in aiding that, reducing the effect of photosensitization. And yeah, so I think zinc's the main one that will help, but also, I haven't actually heard of it on wheat. I've actually heard of it more on lucerne and certain weeds that will interact with photosensitization. But so also offering offering that hay if you haven't already, and maybe a little bit of grain. So if we can dilute the effect of, they've got some intake from a couple of other energy sources, that will possibly help that as well. So we want a really good rumen to help detoxify some of these things. And then things like, additions of mycotoxin binders will help. So the mycotoxin binders, there's a few different types of them. You've got from bentonite, which is a really basic mycotoxin binder, all the way through to ones that will break them down, detoxify, do 3 or 4 things in the system to break them down. And there's a cost scale on that. Obviously, you've got bentonite, which is quite cheap, to some of the really, really good mycotoxin binders that will sort of cover a lot of things off. But in terms of minerals, to answer your questions, zinc will certainly aid in that, and it will have lots of other beneficial effects too, particularly over winter and wet ground and that sort of stuff. So, hope that helps.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us today for a really great presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I got a lot out of it as usual. When you join us, you always give us heaps of information. So thank you very much for putting the presentation together and giving us your time.
My pleasure. It's been good. Thank you.
Thanks to our audience for joining us. Thanks for joining us for question time too, and for all the questions you put in. Most people know I like a good interactive question time, so thank you very much for being a part of it. And a quick thank you once we close down here. A quick survey will flash up on your screen. It'll only take a moment, so I thank you in advance for filling it in. Talk to everyone soon. Thanks. Bye for now.